Chapter 30. Deserved.
"Secure the foot! Batten down those hatches! Someone get on that bow line!"
The Vikings of Berg moved back and forth along the docks, loading the Knurr with metal barrels, furs, and weapons, spurred along by Snotlout Jorgensen's booming orders. He had nothing on Stoic the Vast's formidable holler, but he effectively drowned out the cawing gulls, and that in itself showed promising aptitude for the future chief.
"Is that the last of them?"
Snotlout asked the Viking who just settled a barrel heavily between thwarts.
"Aye," the man nodded. "We're about, chock-a-block."
Snotlout returned the gruff nod with one of his own.
"Right."
Turning to the deck, he barked,
"Finish raising that sail. Man the oars."
The unit of men jumped to the task, repeating the shout as if it hadn't been heard the first time. Ropes were yanked, pulleys utilized, and the great painted sheet spread to the skies. The young man issuing orders showed no outward approval on his face, but inside he had to admire the efficiency at which the Vikings of his village operated. No movement went wasted, no one stumbled into each other or stood blank-faced, wondering what he could do. It was with practiced know-how that these men performed their tasks with the utmost professionalism. Snotlout rested a hand on the stern post and turned his attention back to the village, his home that still looked as damaged as it had been 3 days ago after a most brutal raid. They were running out of resources. Repairs were slowing, and the dragons came wave after wave, unmindful to their struggles to recuperate. Little by little, Berg was being chipped away like a hatchet to an oak. They would hold a little longer, certainly if he had anything to say about it, but even those who didn't fight started to feel the wear on their resilience. He was leading this hunting expedition in preparation for chieftainship, to go to greater lengths to provide food for his village. But the position of leadership was looking less and less appealing as he prepared to take over a dying village. His disparaging thoughts disrupted when an older girl crossing the port to the fisher's dock caught his wandering eye. She blushed, possibly recalling the night they had spent together, and, tucking her head, scuttled onward.
"Dude,"
Snotlout startled, finding Toughnut at his side, dread swaying as he shook his head in the direction of the girl. The muttered word from the blonde sounded close to reproach.
"Is it okay that you—"
Toughnut made a rude gesture with his hand towards Ricket's disappearing form. Snotlout shrugged, appearing solemn.
"I don't really care much. Everyone will look the other way anyway. We have bigger problems to worry about than fidelity. We need the meat."
Toughnut agreed. He harbored no personal care for Snotlout's reputation, other than the obvious fact that his best friend wanted the chieftainship enough to avoid any potentially damaging scandals. He couldn't blame Snotlout in the slightest for his backroom pursuit of the baker's daughter. She turned out rather attractive from the buck-toothed little troll she once was, and had she just a shred less character, he would have taken a stab at her himself.
"Above the mainmast,"
the stockier boy suddenly ordered, as if picking up on Toughnut's less than honorable thoughts.
"You're on the rudder."
The taller boy grinned.
"I love it when you get all commanding on me."
Snotlout smacked the back of Toughnut's head. "Just sit your ass on the top, da."
"Sure thing, boss."
Toughnut saluted with exaggerated mockery. He got a punch to the shoulder for it, but Snotlout was smiling again. It had yet to settle in Toughnut's mind that his boyhood friend would one day lead the tribe. He only saw Lout the Luckster, the guy he would hook loogies off the piers with and climb trees to spy on the women's Laugadagger time. They still took time out of the day to make inappropriate jokes regarding everything under Salt's govern. And yet, for all that, Toughnut saw the changes as well. This was a man who wanted the job, who wanted things to work out in his favor, even if it meant marching the drab path to maturity. Snotlout started to take his grooming seriously, and it was around the time they stopped hunting for the nest and focused on defense that his drive took hold. He focused on his studies as best he could. He attended the thing, taking the floor more and more often, warming his audience a little faster each time, and Toughnut suspected Snotlout trained with his hammer and swordplay more than Astrid did. Hell, the twin noticed Lout hanging around old Fishlegs, looking over the nerd's charts with something akin to interest. Snotlout the Snotface, they called him in their youth, the boorish brute with the brawn of a Viking and the brains of a bull. These days, Toughnut heard more and more often Snotlout the Steadfast, as a publicly dubbed and likely permanent title. The village, once fretting over the fate of the future leadership, now looked on in approval at Snotloud's obvious efforts to meet each standard set by the Haddock line. It had been nearly 150 years since the headman of their clan shifted lineage. They were already in a time of change. What was one more? "All right," Snotloud called in his new, commanding voice that managed to sound a little less obnoxious with each passing day. "Let's set sail." The boat lurched as the sails caught wind, and broad armored backs began to pump back and forth with the strokes of their oars. Sometimes Toughnut felt left behind. He was still a poor farmer's son, still barely literate, with only vigor and daring on his side. He had no title to his name yet, no reputation aside from an adolescent terror. Snotloud would be chief. Fishlegs spent more time in the company of the chief than Toughnut could reason out, and his own sister was getting married in a month's time, which, to this day, remained a concept his mind could not comprehend. But stagnancy would not be accepted. Not by him. Not while everyone else prospered from within these hard times. This was his first hunting expedition since the year's first ice broke. He gained greater experience on the sea with each short trip, and, come next spring, he would depart from Berg for months on end. Out on a real voyage, to the south, where he would trade and barter and fight and drink and meet women of every size. Then, when he had his fill of the free life, he would return to his village with his riches and experiences to wait out the winter until the next spring, when he would travel just a little bit further than the last, provided he had a village to return to. The young Viking dragged his assigned handle to the right, grunting with the effort involved with moving a rudder. The boat turned towards the destination, horizontal to the village, and Toughnut received a sudden, clear view of the ruined fishing dock. It would take weeks to repair the harbor, seeing as homes and weapons got first priority with the available lumber. Toughnut couldn't imagine having to be the one to tell the fishermen they came last, and the long line of renovation, knowing another raid would probably set back that promised date even more. The darker side of responsibility grew more and more apparent with every sacrifice the villagers had to make just to remain standing strong. There were times when Toughnut didn't envy Loud in the least. Northumbria was everything Hiccup remembered it as. Dirty peasants with grime-riddled faces trudging along the countryside, crowded ports and crude language along the coast, and this monotheistic religion spreading across both regions faster than any plague he'd ever heard of. Once again, the boys made the choice to travel out over water during the night and return to the closest safety for daytime rest. While traveling through the mainland meant they were less likely to run into humans, Toothless had a strong preference for saltwater fish, and Hiccup quite enjoyed the opportunity to experience the trades and people coastal villages had to offer. As long as they stayed on their guard and played to their strengths, they would manage just fine. Hiccup's recent encounter with the mermaids turned out quite differently than the first. Something had changed, he knew right from the start by the more openly feral grins they welcomed him with, and he had a good idea what, when they no longer referred to him as a man-child, but as the man who walks in our caves. They gave him all the same treatment as before, the gilly ale, the appropriate reactions to each point in his tale, the excessive giggling that made him feel strangely exposed, but there was something added to it, or perhaps something was taken away. He felt a new jeopardy from being in their presence, one that he acknowledged before, but hadn't felt as exposed to, like a protective force he hadn't appreciated before it had been removed. He endured this perception, carrying out his promise as calmly as he could. The girls seemed to enjoy hearing his story no matter who it came from, and, like last time, pouted when he arrived at current events. Hiccup suspected that, had his stories not been so entertaining, and promised to continue to entertain, the mermaids would have chosen the ending for him, as they doubtlessly had done countless times before. As it turned out, he didn't leave unscathed. It was Marmora who sprang up from the water, grabbed the back of his head with nails that cut into his neck, and captured his mouth in a violent kiss involving more teeth than he'd ever experienced before. His lip bled, but when she pulled away, the fangs he swore he felt puncture his skin were blunted once more. The dragon rider was then told it would be in his best interest to continue the story one day, provided he survived his encounter with the demon he vowed to defeat. Hiccup knew he would return. He knew the underwater cavern suddenly became more dangerous to him. The scar on his lips and the pale crescents branded into the back of his neck proved as much. But he wanted to come back. He was playing with fire, and it was exciting to him. These beautiful mermaid sisters, once teasing towards him and later rough, put him in the sort of situation where he wanted to test his luck. Hiccup re-emerged from the serpent's mouth later that day and trusted back in Toothless's care, and realizing there was something very, very wrong with him. However, the most disturbing thing Hiccup encountered on his polar-bound journey, far more than the behavior of the mermaids, were the rumors. Anytime he stopped in a town and was asked about his destination, the answer north would get him headshakes and much clicking of the tongue. He was warned in English, French, and Norse of the cursed lands that had been taken over by fire beasts. Rumors of plagues, death, and destruction bubbled up with any mention of the Faroes, or Shetlands, or Iceland. Hiccup wasn't overly concerned at first. The North had a rough reputation in those parts, and anyone raised south of Straume was considered soft, for soft-stomached and soft-minded. Hiccup tried to keep an open mind when meeting new people, but sometimes the ugly stigmas with which he was raised painted his reception of these warnings as the South's feeble idea of what constituted as danger. The first small whit of proof he found in these rumors were the ones delivered in his home language. The closer he came to Berg, the more and more Norse-speaking farmers he encountered. Traders and travelers he expected, but an obvious migration had begun. Something was driving Northmen from their homes. From the repeated reference to them, he'd bet his 3 remaining rubies that particular something involved dragons. It was a situation Hiccup knew he would meet head-on soon enough. While he didn't want to work himself up over what could be nothing more than wild suspicions, his gut began to tell him something had gone very wrong in the north. He feared he and Toothless had less time for themselves than they thought. Though this unconfirmed press for time began to dampen his spirits, Hiccup was determined to enjoy each day on the road as best he could. He still believed his involvement wasn't all that crucial to his village's direct survival. These people who looked to the north with wide-eyed fear were the same people who likely didn't know how to fight dragons. He never recalled seeing anyone from Berg or the neighboring Viking tribes, which greatly diminished the credence of their hearsay. He and Toothless settled on the largest of the Farne Islands that morning. A dead seal, speared and carried by Toothless's claws, was half devoured after Hiccup awakened mid-afternoon. The meat was delicious, slightly undercooked, with a more flavorful taste Hiccup had taken to over time. He left the carcass partially submerged in the lapping iced waters of the North Sea to keep it salted and fresh for a later meal. Toothless climbed to one of the higher boughs of a tree, no doubt licking the last traces of blood from his chops and preparing to sleep a little longer. With a full belly and a handful of silver pieces stretching the pouch caught between his belt and tunic, Hiccup saw an opportunity to visit the trading port on the other side of the island, one that faced the mainland. He didn't mind the crowds and shouting and the onslaught of smells when no one looked twice at him. Being around too many people for too long often put him on edge, but Hiccup would always enjoy seeing the mingling of culture, receiving exposure to the different crafts and languages and foods that he had only just begun to acclimate to. A stand of furs first caught his attention, his eyes moving between the beaver and the goat hair cloaks. Summer was approaching, but Hiccup knew it would be in his best interest to buy warmer clothes, especially when Berg's most torrid summer day would match with the relatively mild spring of Miklagard. Already the temperature had dropped several times to raise goosebumps up the bare area of his arms, and he had taken to doubling up on layers during their night flies. He pinched the thin goat-haired cloak between his fingers, liking the way it slipped against his skin. Hiccup couldn't stop the low chuckle that escaped his lips. Out in the world, banking on survival, and he goes and buys half of what he needs. Oftentimes the other half was stolen, and none of it possible without Toothless. The dragon had taught him stealth, that's for sure. Thinking back on it, it was his first weeks with the dragon that he really fell into his underhanded ways, sneaking in and out of the village, misleading the villagers, never boasting of his wins, but never bothering to correct their assumptions either. What a bad influence.
"All right, mate?"
Hiccup spared a glance to his left at the sudden voice, spotting 2 grimy sailors. One leaned against the wooden paling with arms crossed, the other bent over, wincing and cupping his groin. The grimacing one hissed at his smug companion.
"No, I ain't all right. Damn woman smashed me nuts. I'll never have heirs." he squeaked. His friend outright laughed. Where is she? I'll congratulate her. I couldn't point her out if I tried. Can't even tell them apart. There's a whole army of them. Just set port this morning and took over the damn town.
Hiccup kept his eyes on the pile of furs, but his movements of feeling each material stilled. An army of women?
No, sir. I looked stock, too. I think they're pirates. No rhyme or reason for them to be that well off with no men around. Pack of lady pirates, eh?
Hiccup could hear the grin in the fit one's voice.
Ugh, don't even think about it lest you want to end up like me. Oi, you make a habit of eavesdropping, do ya?
Startled at the change in tone, Hiccup looked over at the Saxon sailors. Perhaps he had been too obvious in his interest, for the pained one glared at him, while his still chuckling friend looked him up and down with raised eyebrows.
I don't understand you,
Hiccup exclaimed in his native language, pulling his best bewildered face. The grumpy sailor snorted, his face not softening.
Damn Northmen,
he griped, still massaging the area between his legs. The other sailor pulled away from his resting spot and shook his head.
We'll be seeing a lot more, given the state of things up there.
This, Hiccup pointed to a pile-woven cloak and tossed at the merchant 1 penny, what he thought was plenty for the garment. He received a hesitant look at the bartering, but an impatient expression later had Hiccup walking off with his purchase. State of things up there. That was again another reference to something horrible up north. What was causing all these Northmen to travel south? Before Hiccup could begin to fully trouble himself with the matter, a familiar accented voice caught his attention. "Oi!" He glanced up. His feet jerked to a stop a moment later. A young woman stood across from him, blocking his most direct route out of the port town. Wild blonde hair flowed down her back, unchecked and unbraided, highlighting the unusually dark clothing swathed tightly around her figure, with just enough creases to keep him wondering if there were more than a body hidden within. A wrap covered the sizable bust, with nothing but a dark fur vest over top, and knives hung off every belt loop imaginable. She rested her weight on one jutted hip, her expression flat with dark blue eyes narrowed on him. Her name trickled through his lips in an embarrassed stutter.
Kami?
And he really had to pose it as a question, because not only did she look different, just barely recognizable as his childhood friend, but she behaved differently. Some remarkable calmness exuded from her stance, cooler than he'd ever seen her, and yet she still had that energy that was wholly her, fierce and cocky. It was that combination that filled him with an incomprehensible dread. He should have been more shocked at her sudden and unexpected appearance again, or at the odds of running into her at a port he just happened to visit, but his mind kept blundering at different parts of her rather than taking in the whole picture. "Hiccup," she said, sounding completely unaffected at running into him. "You look a sight taller." Their height difference was now more apparent than ever, with the top of her head just reaching his chin. Still, she had grown as well. Taller, rounder in some areas, the flat of her navel emphasized by the overhang of her top, her chin more pointed, her lips pressed and curved. Or maybe they were always shaped like that, and he never felt the impulse to look at them before. For some reason, Hiccup found the contours of her neck and its slender length more noteworthy than anything else.
"Yeah,"
he managed to breathe out, giving himself a mental slap to the face for letting his mind wander about her. He didn't know what to say. She wasn't yelling at him, but something in her voice came cold, like it deserved a fury she reserved for later. She had never treated him like this before. "So," Kamikaze began in that discomforting, light tone, "where's your dragon?" He winced. Oh, yes, that. Why had he suddenly forgotten that she was a northern Viking in close connection with Berg? Of course she heard of his defection, directly from their most opinioned mouths, no doubt. Hiccup opened his mouth, wondering how to handle this. Was she so mad over it? Would she hit him? He observed her posture with leery eyes. This calmness he'd never seen on her before, so out of place he felt on edge. No, it's not like she'd attack him in the middle of a busy port. Then again, it seemed a bog burglar had just downed that sailor not too long ago, and for the first time Kamikaze looked like a bog burglar. All tantalizing curves and dangerous attraction and forbidding. A very look-but-don't-touch aura had developed sometime between the last chance upon and now. He cleared his throat in a weak cough.
Hiding. There are a lot of humans around.
She made a non-committal noise, the only movement on her face the careful arc of an eyebrow. Was he hiding when I last ran into you? Another delicately posed question. Hiccup reacted again as though they were direct blows. He didn't like this side of her, this manipulative and feminine bearing she addressed him with. He associated her with the frank openness of a Viking, not the scheming ways of a city woman. He didn't want his reception of her altered, and absolutely not because of his actions that she apparently took offense to. The best thing he could do was answer her honestly. He still wanted her as a friend. He could salvage this, hopefully.
Sleeping, I think.
He tried to recall. It seemed a lifetime ago, back when he was unsure of his chosen way. Hiccup shook his head, again finding it hard to focus.
Look, Kami, I'm sorry I didn't tell you, but, well, I just been outlawed. I was all out of sorts. I know how bad it all looks. You probably only heard the worst, but I swear to you, dragons are not what we think they are. I can prove it, if you'll just let me.
At her dubious expression, he felt he had to add,
Come on, it's me. I'm not malicious. I didn't do this to hurt people.
He must have said something right, because some of the tension released from her shoulders, and her eyes closed with an exasperated sigh.
I understand why you didn't tell me. Sort of.
His face lightened.
You do?
She opened her eyes, the sun reflecting in them a violent hue he hadn't recalled before, and she stepped closer. Hiccup found his stare momentarily drawn to the shifting of her hips, appearing wider beneath the cinch of her waist. This was Kamikaze, he reminded himself. He knew from an early age she would grow up to be dangerous and capable and, ultimately, technically, a woman. He just never imagined she would grow up to be this. But I have to ask. His stringent voice returned his gaze to hers. Did you even try to find a way of staying? For reasons unknown to him, Hiccup found himself taken aback by the question. It seemed more appropriate of something his father would ask him, not the girl who always supported a grand adventure, especially those of the impromptu sort.
I thought of several, but...
How would he explain his logic? He hadn't understood it himself at the time. He still didn't understand it today. It was impulse, a half-thought-out, knee-jerk reaction to being put on the spot. He just went with the flow. Something else he would have never trusted himself to do without Toothless by his side, not to the extent he had gone. A heavy sigh escaped Hiccup's lips, without him realizing how antagonized it made him appear.
Look, I left. That's all I can really say, all right? And I don't regret it.
You don't? Crap. She was using that calculating voice again. Kamikaze's jaw clenched, something he recalled as a telltale sign of a mounting anger, and she took another step forward. Because of you... He hadn't realized how close she had gotten until her fist struck him in the chest. Because of you! Because you left! She hit him again with each growled, inconclusive statement, and he took it, grunting with every contact, because he had no idea what was going on.
I am marrying Snotlout.
The bruises that would no doubt blossom from beneath his skin tingled down to numbness, and the laughs and stares of everyone who bothered to pay them any mind were lost against the rush of mystification following that statement. He gripped her fist when she tried to hit him again, clutching her wrist in his other hand when she tried to yank her arm back. Her struggles quickly ceased, the rage that came so suddenly stilling into shock as he looked down at her with a dark and serious expression.
You're what?
Perhaps he hadn't meant to say it so throaty, as a nearby couple jumped with the severity of his response, but at least it calmed her down.
Yes.
And with a great effort, she yanked her arm free of his hold. She didn't attack him again.
We're finally uniting our tribes after generations of joking about it. It's not a joke anymore. It's happening. But
none of it made sense. They didn't do that, not her tribe. Never. And Snotlout? Really?
You're a pot burglar.
She snorted. An ugly contempt twisted her features, poisoning her voice into causticity.
Yeah, I know, right? The first ever to be put into an arranged marriage. What an honor.
Hiccup shook his head, too many questions bumping into each other to stand out above the rest.
What? How? It has to do with the situation that's going on,
she muttered. Much of her ire had deflated, like she had worked this moment over in her head for so long that she found reality wanting.
It's a mess. Everything is changing. Our ways, our traditions. Can't even explain how bad it's gotten. Please explain it to me,
Hiccup stressed. He couldn't paint this as exaggerations and misunderstandings anymore, not with Kamikaze confirming the worst of his half-cocked theories right in front of him.
And explain to me how it's my fault.
So he had left. If anything, it should have made things easier for his tribe. Burke almost enjoyed their confrontation with dragons. It defined them, gave them more opportunities to impress the gods. He had only ever gotten in the way. How could the removal of his presence ever be considered unfavorable? And how did his leaving lead her into an arranged marriage? Kamikaze narrowed her eyes again. Whether it was his strong attitude or the reminder of whatever blame he deserved to partake in, something was about to set her off again.
Well, for starters, if you were still in the damn village, I would be marrying you.
She poked him harshly in the chest, in the same concentrated area where she focused her punching. Hiccup winced, pulling back and rubbing the sore area.
And that's better how? A sight better than Snotlout, she nearly shrieked. He still hawks up balls of snot and spits it out the overhangs. You did that too,
Hiccup felt he had to point out amidst all his mental bedlam.
That's different. I'm a girl. At least when I do it, it looks good.
Hiccup wouldn't argue this, because she seemed more volatile than normal, and she had taken up this new habit of directing her frustrations on him. Astrid and Roughnut he would expect this of, but Kamikaze, until now, had always been the friend he trusted to not subject him to her temper. Then again, she honestly believed he deserved this, something he had to get to the bottom of.
I still don't understand why this marriage is happening.
She heaved an irritated sigh, the expansion of her chest so not worth focusing his attention on, even if it sort of happened.
We don't travel as much anymore, she started. We can't. Our home village is being attacked by dragons more and more, like yours was. I mean, this thing is spreading. And now everything's changing. Changing enough that my mom and your dad decided it was time for a damn proper alliance. It's that bad?
Hiccup whispered. He would have pressed her for more details regarding this thing that was spreading, but Kamikaze bore such a troubled look on her features that he feared she was going to cry.
I'm sorry,
he mumbled. Her eyes hardened, and the spark of anger ignited within relieved him more than it should have. Fists were easier to deal with than tears.
You're sorry? You're sorry I'm marrying Snotlout? Or you're sorry that our entire culture is dying while you're off buying furs and drinking and who knows what?
She looked ready to hit him again.
Well, I still don't understand how it's my fault. I wouldn't be marrying Snotlout for one thing, she snapped.
The people who had lost interest once Kamikaze stopped punching him were back to staring again. Why did she always have to cause a scene? Hiccup made the mistake of shushing her.
Don't you shh me,
she snarled. She waved her hands angrily as she spoke, her hair flying with each movement, painting the alluring picture of a jungle cat.
You left, and everything went to hell. Kami, your dad was a mess. He had to choose Snotlout as his next in line. Look, no, your entire village is changing, and now mine is, and you don't even care enough to... You're being unreasonable. I know you're upset. You don't know anything. You left. You lied.
Hiccup grabbed her shoulders and kissed her in a spare moment of a closed mouth. It was fast, a brief touching of lips, and he silently patted himself on the back for marking hers correctly in the first place, given the circumstances. Most importantly, it shut her up. He pulled away from her almost as fast as the duration of the peck itself, mostly for self-preservation reasons, but also for shock of his own actions. Kamikaze's mouth opened and closed, working in wordless stupefaction as she stared, wide-eyed, at the boy she used to think of as an older little brother. Hiccup knew his own expression couldn't have been too far off from matching.
You kissed me,
she finally stuttered out. She touched the fleshiest part of her bottom lip as if unsure if it was still part of her face. Hiccup had no explanation for himself, so he tried to think back on any reason she deserved what he just did. His chest continued to throb.
Well, you hate me. But you just kissed me,
she repeated, louder.
You.
More people stared.
I'll kiss you again if you don't calm down,
he threatened. Kamikaze threw a hand over her mouth.
I'm calm.
Hiccup wasn't quite sure how to take that, but awkward kissing reaction aside, some element of normalcy had returned between them. He could recognize her a little better as the girl he grew up with, and if there were anyone, any human he would first share the full truth of his life with, it would be her.
Would it help if I introduce you to Toothless?
Kamikaze slowly lowered her hand from her mouth.
Who?
Kamikaze sat on the opposite side of the campfire from the Night Fury, still thoroughly fascinated with the beast of lore despite enduring its presence for the rest of daylight. Even more fascinating was the way Hiccup leaned against the dragon like it was a comfy bedroll rather than a wild beast perfectly capable of tearing the boy's head off with one chomp. Over the leftover seal, the outlaw regaled her with a dressed-down version of the last 2 years. Not once, throughout Hiccup's outline of the meeting, befriending, and journeying, did she move her eyes from the duo. This led to her missing her mouth on several occasions as she tried to feed herself the salty seal meat. The young bog heiress feared she wasn't able to fully hide her apprehension upon her first introduction to the dark monster. Toothless's reputation preceded him, after all. But all negative emotions were eradicated as soon as Hiccup moved her hand to touch the smooth, surprisingly warm scales of the dragon's hide. She ended up giving Toothless a good belly rub that had the dragon squirming on the ground like a kitten, and from there her entire view of her generation-long enemy was broken down and reworked. Had she met the dragon a year ago, she would have immediately demanded a ride, desperate for a taste of anything so forbidden as the skies. A year ago, her tribe only trained for the occasional clash with the beasts, with far more effort thrown into the sea battles and pirating. A year ago, such short exposure to the beastly nature would have left her in a far better mind for change. But the bog burglars had been torn apart, supplies ravaged, and village ransacked, to the point where such a fast acceptance of a dragon's gift left her wary. She had raised weapons against differently colored scales than the ones she pampered. She felt the heat of their fire and saw the power in their ruthless anger. She had seen every horrible dragon tale used to keep children's behavior in line proven true. And now she was hearing an unprecedented account of their war, showing a completely new side to dragons, expected to somehow work this into a plausible reality. Toothless watched the recently arrived woman with the same intensity that she bestowed upon him, though with far less wariness. He could sense her affection towards the boy. These two seemed to have a deep friendship that connected them through an overlaying tension palpable even to a dragon. Toothless expected there was something very human going on between the two, something that would take Hiccup a good day to fully manage to explain it to him.
"This woman was from your tribe?"
Toothless ventured. The only introduction he received regarding the female was a name, Kamikaze, and that she was an old friend.
"Friends of a tribe,"
Hiccup corrected from against his hide. Kamikaze stared at Hiccup.
"What?" "I was talking to him,"
Hiccup explained with such normalcy that Kamikaze found herself accepting that easily.
"Is it safe to have him so close to all those people?" she asked.
She liked Toothless. There was something absolutely heartwarming about the way he would wriggle his tail and let his tongue loll out of his mouth as Hiccup showed her the best places to scratch. But she couldn't stop her mind from overlapping the absolute horror he was capable of. Toothless showed no offense to this question. He made a whomping noise from his throat and rested his chin on his paws. Hiccup grinned and scratched behind a jaw fin.
"Do you care that much about their safety?"
"No, but you do." Hiccup couldn't help but care about people, especially ones whose death he could have an indirect hand in. At least that's how she remembered him as. She currently hoped he hadn't changed so much as to become callous. She already had trouble connecting the boy from her memory to the young man who caught her punch. Hiccup shook his head.
"Trust me, looking at our histories, I'd say I'm more dangerous to people than he is."
Kamikaze chuckled at that, and it warmed Hiccup to see her relaxing after their initial reunion. They were pretending the kiss never happened. They were even pretending Kamikaze's meltdown didn't happen. Still, something between them was strained, and it could have been Hiccup's actions towards her, or the fact that, technically, their loyalties no longer should have allowed them to be friends. Thankfully, neither of them put much pension in the expectations of others.
"So it's all true? The thing about the war being controlled by one dragon?"
Kamikaze asked, because she felt she had to. It would give the beginnings of an explanation for the phenomenon that was happening up north.
I'm not sure it's even a dragon,
Hiccup said softly.
But, yes, that changes things quite a bit.
Kamikaze couldn't help but wonder if, someday, she could have a dragon companion as Hiccup had Toothless. She needed chance and luck on her side to even consider it a possibility, but once the idea popped up in her head, it would forever remain a secret hope.
Yeah,
Hiccup agreed.
So, are you going to tell me what's been up on your end? I still don't understand how you're getting married. I mean, you're a bog burglar, yes, I know, she muttered. She took a breath and forced a smile on her face that looked so strained Hiccup would have preferred she hadn't bothered at all. Tell you what, you buy me a drink and I'll explain the whole situation to you. Go, Toothless urged before Hiccup could get a single word out. The human glanced down at his friend. Go, Toothless repeated. This human is special to you. You were close, weren't you? Maybe you could learn more about what we're getting into. I don't think she's very comfortable around me. Hiccup nodded, knowing the dragon was right. If there were any human who would share his enthusiasm for flying dragons, it would have been Kamikaze. Regrettably, he feared he was too late in exposing her. Whatever happened up north, whatever was happening, was affecting the Vikings every bit, if not more, than the trading and farming Northmen. Maybe revealing Toothless to Kamikaze when he last saw her would have prevented this, could have saved her from this insecurity, could have given him another ally willing to support interspecies friendship. Another decision with alternate consequences he could only speculate about. All right, he agreed. One drink. They matched each other ale for ale, with Kamikaze teasing Hiccup about having a stronger alcohol tolerance than she expected from a sissy, and Hiccup remarking on her own endurance for having such a short stature. Their refreshing banter only punctuated what ended up being mostly sobering matters. Hiccup learned of an increasing frequency in dragon attacks. What he remembered as a bi-monthly occurrence now became weekly raids in some areas. As Kamikaze fed Hiccup information from the humans' end, his own mind supplanted what he knew from Toothless. Hearing that the raids extended in precinct told Hiccup the demon's hold over the dragons had as well, just as Toothless said would happen. It was spreading by the week, and as the demon gained power, it gained an army, and as it gained an army, it gained power. It was on an upswing. What first occurred over centuries had concentrated to decades without the humans realizing, thanks to their short lifespans. Then to years, possibly to months, and now, by the week, they were seeing a difference. Hiccup thought they had years to deal with this, that the demon's power would grow at a similar rate to what it had been, but apparently their time of departure just happened to precede the tipping point. Hiccup had to get up there, he had to stop this before it got out of hand, and yet he didn't rightly know how. He couldn't without gathering more information first. Even then, the sheer mechanics of victory seemed impossible. The most likely situation would involve him and Toothless getting themselves killed, followed by the end of Vikingdom as they knew it. Hiccup took a deep swallow from his mug, the flavor of sweet ale strong in the gruit. What a cheerful prospect. It's not just us, Kamikaze went on, nose hanging over the rim of her own drink. It's villagers who are more unprepared than the bloody Saxons would be. That's why all these northerners are coming down here. They ain't got nowhere else to go. And alliances are being forged left and right by those that are staying. Villages that used to fight constantly are banding together just to survive. And that's when our villagers decided it was time to make a more concrete one. Alliance, that is. Snotlot's taking over, and I'm to marry him and provide an heir, two if I can. I need to give at least one daughter to go to my tribe. Burke said they'd prefer a son, but your dad demanded there be at least a legitimate heir. I don't think he wants any more confusion over who's to take over ever again. She stopped then, her eyes unfocused on her laden, wavering reflection. I'm not even going to be a bog burglar anymore. I'm going to be another baby-making housewife who gets fat and thinks up a list of excuses not to be touched by her husband. She choked on the word. Hiccup could think of nothing to say. The dragon situation he would do what he could with, but the politics of a village he wasn't even a part of anymore was out of his hands. Maybe there's a way around it, he tried. Or maybe it won't be as bad as you think.
Who was he trying to convince? Of course it would be. Marriage for Kamikaze would be like someone telling him he had to spend the rest of his life with both feet on the ground. Kamikaze gripped the hair above her forehead, resting her weight on her elbow and appearing more distraught than Hiccup had ever seen her. I can't do it. I can't. The more I think about it, the more it makes me sick. I know I'm supposed to set an example, lead the way into this new era that's supposedly going to help us survive. Tribes have been merging left and right, but I just can't. Hiccup didn't want to see her like this. This wasn't his friend of old who would find humor in any situation, find any misfortune a challenge to be bested.
Kami,
she shook her head. I know it's selfish of me to say this, but I don't want to get married for the sake of my tribe.
Kami,
Hiccup cut in because he couldn't stand to see her so out of thoughts like this. He put a hand on her bare shoulder, hardly registering the missing fur west she arrived in.
Listen to me. I know how hard it is to make judgment calls when obligations and honor are involved. Believe me, I get it. But deciding to be selfish every now and then does not make you a bad person.
I'll feel like a bad person, she mumbled.
You'll feel bad married,
he countered.
Kami, you only get one life on Midgard. Is this how you want to spend it?
She wouldn't meet his eyes, but he could tell she listened to him. Then what do I do? Leave? She didn't have a dragon to watch her back. She was tough, but she didn't want to be alone. Hiccup shrugged.
I can't answer that. But I'd rather face regret over inaction than regret doing nothing at all.
He hopped on that dragon and left. He braved the world with nothing but a night fury in his journal at his side. Look where he was now. Chatting up his friend turned bell. Over the course of the night and a steady feeding of alcohol, Hiccup's mind lost the ability to avoid certain wanderings, until some could be considered inappropriate in the face of her plight. Through a hard swallow, Hiccup finally admitted to himself that he found Kamikaze attractive. He found other women attractive before as well, but not to the point where he had almost no self-control over the focus of his thoughts. It wasn't normal to feel so hyper-aware of someone. You reckon it could have been because of their history that his brain seemed so morbidly fascinated with their physical changes in the first place. It was like suddenly having an upgraded weapon model presented to him. A horrible analogy, but it was the best reasoning he could come up with after 4 mugs of ale.
Yeah, I guess.
Kamikaze continued to speak indistinctly, not seeming all that convinced. Her face had pinkened, and Hiccup was sure the alcohol finally started to take a toll on her.
You know, everything started changing once you left. Oh, here we go.
Hiccup dropped his hand from her shoulder, returning his double-palmed hold of his mug.
I'm serious. You were gone, your dad freaked out, the dragons freaked out. The next thing I know, I'm told I get the honor of creating the first tangible alliance with Burke. I didn't start this,
Hiccup snapped, waving his hand towards whatever direction he decided north would be in that moment.
It started centuries before. He took a breath, forcing calm over himself. But I'll end it.
As the words slipped from his mouth, his memory brought forth the flash of a cape and a parting. I won't apologize, but I will take responsibility.
What do you mean?
Hiccup refocused on the girl beside him and realized he hadn't exactly told her his plan to deal with the demon. He mentioned from Huria, neglecting to mention the godly portion, and she scoffed when he told her the weapon only shot special arrows. But she believed him when he said he had gotten exceptionally good with archery. Maybe cluing her into more of his agenda would help set things right, with however she managed to skew her situation as his fault.
Why do you think I'm back up here? I mean, I didn't know how bad things had gotten, but I was planning on taking a stab at fixing this situation. Toothless can get me to the demon and—
Wait, hold up! She held a hand up, flat-palmed and closer to his face than he was comfortable with. You're going to find the demon that controls dragons? On a dragon.
Toothless will be fine,
Hiccup insisted.
As long as I'm with him, I won't let him go mad. Besides, we're just going to scope things out a bit. Then we'll take a stab at trying to kill it.
Her brow rose, and she looked faint. Just you? Just you and the little night fury? Which, by the way, is much smaller than I thought he'd be, so... Hiccup felt insulted on Toothless's behalf.
Hey, Toothless is fast. As long as we're vigilant, we won't get caught.
A bit of a white lie, but she needn't know that. Kamikaze breathed heavily through her nose, her jaw clenching in the telltale sign of anger.
Do you think that makes me feel better? Well, this has to stop, doesn't it? It has to end.
Just the two of you, you and your little beau. Have you gone mad?
We're the only ones who can, who know. We're definitely the only ones willing to work together to get the job done, because, from what I've gathered, humans alone can't defeat it, and neither can dragons.
Her head shook. She didn't want to hear this.
No, you're going to get yourself killed.
No.
Odin,
Hiccup hissed.
I thought you'd be pleased. I'm doing something to try and fix this. If I succeed, maybe you won't have to marry Snotlout.
You thought I'd be pleased? She didn't sound pleased, not in the least. Pleased that you and Toothless are just going to confront this monster? Hiccup swore he saw the tightness of her jaw slacken just enough for her lip to tremble. Great. Perfect. I'll be married to a guy who still refers to my breasts as jugs, and you'll be dead. And then we'll all be dead soon after. Oh, I can't wait for this to play out. The sarcasm and anger saturating her words couldn't cover the lack of control over her features, which continued to reveal more and more grief as she went on. Hiccup pressed his brows together, unable to find the words to soothe her. He reached up to touch her shoulder again.
I'm sorry.
She jerked out of his grasp.
I don't care if you're sorry. This is just one big, hellbound situation. There's no happy ending for anyone.
Hiccup leaned in closer, wanting to placate her, to lower her voice, to bring back the perpetually happy girl who used to cheer him up.
I'm sorry.
I don't care, she repeated, but this time she didn't scoot away from him. To Hiccup's horror, her voice wavered through her anger, and the thinning of her eyes shifted into borderline anguish. I can't believe you. I just... You're going to die. You don't even understand what it's like up there. You've been gallivanting around the world without a care, and you're just going to come back and...
I'm sorry.
His voice dropped. He drew closer, cupping her face in his hands, feeling her jaw working through her complaints.
I'm sorry,
I don't care. Hiccup wasn't going to repeat himself, and Kamikaze soon found she wasn't going to continue to try and place blame on him, because suddenly his mouth was on hers, and her stomach was somewhere high in her throat, like she had suddenly been dropped and half her body hadn't realized it yet. And this time it wasn't the unexpected fast motion that dazed her brain out of sheer audacity. This time she saw him move in with time to spare, saw the way his eyes lowered to her lips just after he reached for her face. This time she expected it, and this time she actually acknowledged the feel of Hiccup Horrendous Haddock III's lips on hers as he lingered against her mouth. This time he was kissing her, really kissing her. He wasn't pulling away, and neither was she, and she could feel his ale-moistened lips slide along hers, and the tip of his nose against her cheek, warm breath to tickle the top of her lip. An indeterminate moment passed before his kiss loosened enough for her to mumble, "You gotta stop that." He drew away, and it took the loss of that pressing sensation to realize her eyelids had lowered shut. Her lashes fluttered open to find Hiccup's eyes still closed, his bottom lip caught between his teeth.
I'm sorry,
he murmured for the umpteenth time. Only then did he look at her, ashamed and genuinely apologetic for his actions, those of today and of the past. Kamikaze decided right then and there that an apology wasn't what she wanted from him after all. "I'm not," she whispered deftly, and she moved forward to continue what he started before he could fully settle back and hiss. A piece of Hiccup's mind screamed at him for accepting her so readily into his arms. This was Kamikaze. This was not a woman who could hardly communicate with him, and this was not an intangible girl from his dreams. This was someone who occupied his first memories, someone who he bathed with in the first Laugadar, spent summer month with building mud houses for fairies. She was the Viking who could snitch the horns off a helmet and have the wearer none the wiser. She was the Viking who could best a swordsman 3 times her size, with a wild smile on her face and insults to cow a sailor. Never did he think of her as a girl, and all that applied to girls. Through all of the parental jokes of betrothals between the tribes and the teasing of his peers for having her sleep in his house during her visits, not once did he actually believe kamikaze was an option for female companionship. And yet, here he was, kissing this vixen that had possessed the body of his childhood friend. Maybe it was the difference in her behavior, coupled with her more developed physique, which suddenly made her a viable choice. And maybe it was the absolute taboo of what they were doing that made her taste so good. This felt so off, immoral, off limits. Right and wrong warred with every sensual contact between their bodies, and that conflict somehow made it better. Maybe being told he couldn't have her made him want her all the more. Hiccup knew he should have felt ashamed for entertaining such thoughts, but feeling he could screw everything up with his compulsion kept his heart beating and his lips moving and his hands roaming. It was the hazard of destroying his oldest human-linked friendship in a moment of pride and impulse that made this so good. It was the danger, like flying. Nothing felt rewarding if there wasn't risk involved. And she was meant to marry Snotlout. Snotlout, who was always closer to Astrid than he could ever hope to be, who Astrid would talk to. Snotlout, who was always the better Viking, the son his father wished for. Snotlout, who was going to take over the chieftainship that Hiccup could never measure up enough for. The bitter, possessive thoughts that suddenly took over his suppressed brain activity felt like a kick to the ribs. Oh gods, what was he doing? Hiccup pulled back with a faint, wettish pop, keeping a hand firmly on Kamikaze's shoulder to prevent any kiss initiation on her part.
"Stop,"
he commanded gruffly.
"No, we don't want this."
He hated how he sounded like he was trying to convince himself. Kamikaze's shock at being rebuffed quickly fell into a morose countenance, and she snatched her drink from the table, taking a heavy gulp.
"Maybe I want this." "No, you don't."
Still not sounding confident.
"Yes, I do."
But her eyes weren't meeting his.
Shit,
Hiccup thought. He really buggered this up. He knew he should have stopped before. Kissing her would only make things uncomfortable. He was attracted to her, yes, but she was still Kamikaze underneath it all. Still the same girl despite the new reservations, distress, and burdens, and that meant they couldn't possibly manage relations while sustaining their long-standing platonic ties. Right?
"You look good,"
Kamikaze suddenly mentioned, as if speaking aloud an earlier afterthought.
"I know I didn't say it to you when I first saw you, but it's what I was thinking."
"You were thinking of kicking my ass,"
Hiccup pointed out, willing to embrace the chance for somewhat normal conversation.
"Right, that too."
She smiled at him, but he could see the candlelight reflected too harshly in her eyes. She was still upset.
"But I also thought you looked good. Your hair and all. Outlawry suits you."
He gave a half-cocked grin.
"Thanks. I thought so myself."
She laughed, abrupt, and chewed on her bottom lip thoughtfully. Perfect. Now he was looking at her lips, and she was looking at his. He knew this because he tried to look at her eyes, only to find them darkened with want. Something broke inside him. He didn't care if she was going to marry Snotlout or what kind of man this made him.
"You really want this?"
"Yeah," she laughed again, hollow, like she couldn't believe it herself.
"Yeah, I really, honestly want this."
She turned from him then and took another gulp of her ale, her fourth fill by his measurements, still keeping up with him. Frowning, Hiccup reached for the cup and pulled it away. "Hey!" She started to protest, but Hiccup grabbed the slim hand that tried to retain her glass and wrapped his fingers around it. She stared at the difference in size and complexion before moving her faltering line of sight back to him.
"If you really want this, then I want you to remember this. Me."
He didn't know where this confidence came from or these words. Natural pride spurred by alcohol, perhaps. The challenge of making her cry his name at least once in a volume he had yet to discover. Or maybe the thought of Snotlout marrying her, doing what he was about to do, bothered him more than he was willing to admit. He wanted her first. He wanted her to understand what he was capable of. He didn't want to lose his friend to them. Not to the Vikings, not to his former tribe. He didn't want her to become the fat, bitter wife she feared was her future, never knowing him as anything more than Hiccup the useless, Hiccup the outlawed. He would not be forgotten.
"Wow,"
she mumbled, staring hard at his lips again with those dark, nebulous eyes that made his stomach clench.
"Look at you, taking command.
She didn't stop him when he brought his hand up to cup the back of her neck, tilting her face towards his in a willing invitation. His mouth hovered over hers, the finest threads of restraint snapping one by one. "By Thor, we're actually doing this," she whispered against his open mouth, the skin of the lips grazing with the gentle motions. The lips just barely caught each other when something in Kamikaze's words pulled at Hiccup's logic, and, for the second time, he found a more reserved part of him vying for his attention. He slowly drew away, like a fog clearing from an early morning port.
Yeah, you're right. It's weird, and besides, you..."
She grabbed his head, forcing on him a bruising, nearly painful kiss. "Shut up," the burglar hissed through their mashed lips. Hiccup was taken aback by the strength in which she responded to his questioning. This wasn't pure desire that drove her to him. This was desperation as well. His mind wasn't working at full speed. He wanted to continue to work over all the reasons this shouldn't happen, the immoral and shameful feelings behind their actions, but his self-control was slipping. He couldn't fight this anymore, not when Kamikaze, unexpectedly beautiful and untouchable, threw herself at him, smelling of ale, the ocean, and something forbidden. Hiccup firmly slowed her display of dominance almost as soon as it began, drawing her into his tempo, easing, warming her into this intimate kiss she'd likely never experienced in all her exploits. He didn't know how many men Kamikaze had been with, but his quick takeover of method told him kissing had never been a focal point for her. He was in control this time, and knowing that only fueled the confidence she brought out in him. He was the first to best Kamikaze in a duel of this sort. His hands traveled the length of her sides, a slightly awkward endeavor given their seating, but completely manageable after a number of drinks and a lust-induced fog. He tested the firmness that Doris lacked and found it just as desirable. Kamikaze was a woman, of action. She had scars, no doubt, and blemished skin that scratched over compact muscle, and it defined her. It reminded him of who this was, and he found the thought less and less twisted. He squeezed one of her hips he never could have imagined would find their way onto her body, and she sighed, sagging into his frame even more, the harsh grip of her hand subsiding. She began to trail her fingers through his hair and across the back of his neck in time to his own hand movements.
"Why, this is a public establishment, it is."
They broke apart at the barman's incensed cry, unmistakably directed at them. Up until that point, Hiccup thought they managed to be pretty discreet, when Kamikaze wasn't shouting at him, that is, but the owner's yell spurred an uprising of hoots and cheers from the drunken patrons.
"Keep it going,"
someone yelled from the back, and Hiccup felt an overwhelming urge to bury his face in his arms. He wondered how much English Kamikaze knew when she only grinned wider upon hearing the shout. While he laughed seeing her back at her old self, did it have to be at his expense?
"These northerners are kings,"
another called out, flustering Hiccup further. And then a familiar pair of voices.
"What's he got that I don't? Working jarbles, for one thing. Get!"
Apparently, Kamikaze did know English, because she smiled broadly at the angered Saxon behind the bar.
"Give us room. On house. Or we sex on table here."
She slapped the wood, sharking the liquid left in their drinks. This, of course, received even more roars of approval from the already rowdy tavern. All of Hiccup's manly confidence evaporated, and his cry of "What?" coincided with the barman's. He dearly hoped his was the lower-pitched one.
"Are you nuts?" he hissed. "What are you doing? What room? This isn't a damn brothel."
"This is an island," she muttered from the side of her mouth.
"They're just separated enough from the nearest lord to get away with it. Why do you think there's an upstairs?"
Bewildered, Hiccup glanced around the murky alehouse until he spotted the bottom steps of a stairwell just visible in the poor lighting. The architecture and crowd had hidden it well. Funny how Kamikaze noticed it right away. The owner seemed just as shocked as Hiccup, though probably more at Kamikaze's stipulations, and growled,
"What kind of business you think I'm running here, you bent?"
"Fine." Kamikaze pouted, like the prospect of exhibitionism actually sounded appealing to her. "On him, then."
"I bought the drinks,"
Hiccup squawked, indignation written all over his face. Ignoring him, Kamikaze handed the still glowering man a couple silver pieces. For a moment, Hiccup thought he actually won his point, until he patted his side and felt a missing knot in his belt.
"Hey!"
The blonde grabbed his hand and lugged him through the applauding crowd and up the stairs. Hiccup was so bewildered at the force she exhibited that he hardly remembered to feel embarrassed. It was dark, and they stumbled up the indistinguishable steps. Kamikaze seemed to know where she was going, and Hiccup inanely wondered if all such places were designed the same. The sobering walk, and seeing her pick a door, one that no doubt led to a bed, cleared his head enough for the questions to re-emerge.
"Kami,"
he called, just stopping her from entering the room.
I shouldn't have.
He could feel her fingers pressed against his lip, silencing his half-cocked excuses. Only her face was caught in the window light of the hall, the usually tan skin shining white in the moon, and her eyes clearer than he anticipated. It was more than moonlight he caught reflected back at him. He saw need. She was begging him not to question this, to let it happen, for her. She was desperate for this. There was something about the way she kissed him earlier that carried the barest hints of remembrance, and it occurred to him what it was. Destitution. She wanted to forget. She wanted to pretend. This was another escape. He was an escape. He was Doris's escape, and he was about to become Kamikaze's. And it was ironic, because escaping was his specialty, his vice, and his weakness. He was fleeting, in and out of people's lives, forgettable to some, memorable to others, but he would never stay. He couldn't bring himself to. He was being used, and he deserved it. Her hands were upon his face, palms rubbing along the stubble, roughed skin with a wonder of their own.
"Just keep kissing me like that,"
she told him in that sensual, potent combination of demand and a plea. And because he knew how wrong it was, he did. He would not be forgotten. No window cast light into the room. The candle at the bedside had burned out forever ago. There wasn't much to the light's stick to begin with, probably used countless times before them, and only a cold, hardened mess of wax slumped over the table remained. She thought the familiar scene would help her do this, help pretend Hiccup was just another man she found attractive, and then shaken out at the last minute and gulp down some common rue. But he was different. Of course he was. He always had to be, and she couldn't forget him because he wasn't forgettable to begin with. He treated her with familiarity, and perhaps he had an unfair advantage over former relations, but it added an intimacy she never felt before. Never take to bed a man with which you are too familiar. Kamikaze wanted to look over at him, to see his profile one last time, in whatever light her eyes could collect in the unlit setting, but that would only make this more punishing. She had to keep pretending this was someone else. When seeking a partner, always have one objective eye. She breathed deeply, smelling him and her and the overall mustiness of the room, steeling herself for the hardest part of the night. She still had to leave. She was a bog burglar. It was part of their code. Never lead a man on. Always be open with your intentions. Avoid giving them the opportunity to convince you otherwise. Disappear before they can stop you. This was mostly for the younger women, standards to live by to keep them on the right track. As a burglar aged, it became less and less likely for whimsical feelings to carry her away. Occasionally, one would be tempted into marriage, but Kamikaze wasn't one of those. She couldn't be. The cracks in the shoddy ceiling told her it was night still, and the soundless atmosphere beyond the walls and below told her the patrons left long ago. It was the perfect time. With practiced movements, Kamikaze slowly eased herself away from the body beside her, pulling the rough sheets back as silently as possible. She swore she didn't jostle the bed or disturb him in the slightest. Her movements were too smooth. So feeling those strong fingers suddenly tighten around her wrist startled her into a light gasp.
"Stay."
She couldn't make anything out in the dark, but he sounded barely conscious with his sleep-roughened voice, and she would bet her bronze dirk that his eyes were closed. She tried to pull away, half-hearted in her attempts, because the sound of his voice felt like chains had been thrown on her.
"I have to," she whispered. "I need to." "Stay," he repeated, stronger but no less sleep-bungled. "I promise you'll be the first to leave."
And he tugged her hard enough to win against her quickly crumbling reluctance. The bed was crap, and the material reeked of their activity, but somehow the warmth within seemed more inviting than she'd ever expect. The fact that he understood her so well, her needs and her whims, enticed her back to his side. Never kiss. She had already broken too many rules that night. He can touch you with his lips anywhere but your own. What was one more? Kamikaze lowered herself back to the mattress, settling beneath the covers. She allowed Hiccup to draw her close to his body, their knees overlapping. Now so near to him, she could see that his eyes were closed, and wondered if he were even aware of the hand she felt roaming over the skin above her hip. For the first time, Kamikaze didn't mind having a man's hand on her for anything other than carnal pleasure. She wasn't being carried away. She was just delaying the inevitable. This was Hiccup, after all. They caused trouble when they were together all the time. This was simply trouble of a different sort. Maybe just this once she would stay until morning. Hiccup understood what she was, who she was. Hiccup understood what she was, who she was. He didn't expect anything from her, except, perhaps, her forgiveness. She pressed her forehead against his collarbone and breathed in assent. Tonight she would pretend. She would pretend she wasn't a bog burglar, and she would pretend this was a world where Hiccup hadn't left. A possible future that eluded them long ago. Come morning, Hiccup would not remember the brief exchange.